You've got the Clovis being the fluted points, Folsom being the deeper fluted points, and then Plano being these unfluted points. So like the like Jethro Tull without Ian Anderson, basically.
So the listener can't see that Ken just checked his notes for that joke. I'm just gonna put him on that.
Yeah. The New Brunswick Archaeology Podcast, featuring your hosts, Gabe Reineck and Ken Holyoke.
Well, welcome back to the New Brunswick Archaeology Podcast. I'm Gabe Reineck, joining you from New Hampshire today, and I'm joined as always by Ken Holyoke, who is in Lethbridge, Alberta. How are you, Ken?
Not too bad. We're international tonight.
We are international tonight, and in fact, that brings me to our first order of housekeeping business, which is that we still do not have a new name for this podcast, which means that the prize has rolled over, and in fact, much like Mega Millions, we've upped the ante on this. So it's joining
an iterative jackpot.
It is an iterative jackpot. Are we allowed to say that and still maintain the non-explicit rating on this program?
I'm not sure.
Well, anyway, the iterative jackpot this week is that because I'm joining you from Manchester, New Hampshire, which listeners will have to regard as a bit of foreshadowing for next week when we talk about the Neville site in the Atlantic Slope tradition. I'm about a kilometer or a kilometer and a half maybe from where the bridge abutment that blasted out the Neville site now sits. And so the Neville site is one thing that Manchester, New Hampshire is known for. But Ken, do you know what food was invented in Manchester, New Hampshire?
I don't.
The chicken tender.
No way.
Manchester, New Hampshire, the Puritan Back Room, which is a well-regarded and I have to say quite excellent restaurant and ice cream parlor here in New Hampshire, invented the chicken tender. And so
just a sec. Did you say the Puritan Back Room?
That's what it's called. Yeah. Speaking of the explicit rating we've just sacrificed.
What goes on in a Puritan back room?
Well, it's essentially a large family restaurant run by a Greek family for a very long time. So it's sort of if a Greek diner went and became very similar to a Friendly's. I don't know if you were ever in a Friendly's in New England.
Yeah.
But it went a little bit more corporate.
Like Smitty's or Denny's for our Canadian listeners.
Yeah. But with a huge lofted ceiling and a takeout window, and the food is pretty good actually, and the tendies are delicious. But so anyway, if someone comes up with the winning name this week, what we're going to offer is that you get we're calling this the New England Archaeology Tour Package. Oh. And the way this works, you get to join me. Ken will fly in for this, and we will get the complete set of chicken tenders. That means that you'll get the spicy, the traditional, and the ranch at the Puritan Back Room. Subsequent to that, we will go to where the bridge abutment sits on top of the Neville site. We will climb over the no trespassing sign. I'm sure I've never done this before. We will dodge the heroin needles that now litter the site, and then we will observe the site. But we'll do this for the full New England experience while clutching extra large Dunkin' Donuts iced coffees. So this is what we've got. So send those in as always. And Ken, what's our email address again?
New Brunswick Archaeology @gmail.com.
It's still fantastic that wasn't taken.
Yeah, it is very surprising. So we'll call this one maybe the An Evening on the Merrimack.
Oh, that's a great name. Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah. Merrimack River.
It's just as lovely as it sounds, just as merry. And And it's really everything you could possibly desire in archaeotourism down here in southern New England. We're sponsored this week, as always, by the Association of Professional Archaeologists of New Brunswick. They can be visited at apainb.ca. And I was actually talking to Trevor Dow this morning, and
President of the APA&B.
he is. He's not just a handsome man; he's a powerful man. And Trevor, he said he gave, that I appreciate the read you gave last time, but I'm concerned that you just don't have that Canadian voice, that Canadian charisma. So maybe you could let Ken do it. And I said, no, Trevor, no one. I take a backseat to absolutely no one in my love for the APNB. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to just insert an aspirated yes at some point in a subsequent podcast. And that aspirated yes will be fully paid for by the APNB, and all of our listeners will know that. Ken and I realized that we made a slight error in the last podcast, and so this segment we're calling Hakuna Errata.
And this will be a recurring segment too. We're a fact-based podcast, and we're not above calling out ourselves for when we mix up the facts.
That's exactly right. And so my understanding is several G's off in a factoid we shared with the listeners. Several G's, incidentally, being the amount it costs to get a sponsorship on this podcast.
13 G's, actually. So Canada, in the last podcast, we were talking about federal heritage legislation, and I misspoke and said that Canada was the only G20 nation without federal heritage legislation. We are actually the only G7, the only G7 nation without federal heritage legislation. So we're 13 G's off, and I'm not sure the composition of those 13 G's, but that's the kind of the target for our fundraising appeal right now, isn't it?
I think that's exactly the target. I think with 13 G's, we would have matching fleece vests at this year's CAA meeting.
If one can only hope.
Yeah, to say nothing of the lapel pins that we would undoubtedly have. What we're going to talk about this fortnight is Paleoindians. And so these are the indigenous inhabitants of New Brunswick between about 13,000 and 9,000 years ago. And I think maybe a good place to start with our discussion is just with the term Paleoindian, which is going to sit gratingly on the listeners' ears, and it's going to sit gratingly with us when we say it. And so what I'm going to do is begin by saying why I still use the term Paleoindian, and then Ken can chime in with why he does or does not. And so the reason that I'm still using this term is that even though the second half of that word is one that we don't use to describe indigenous people anymore because it refers to an error on the part of Columbus, there's this challenge in that term achieved real acceptance on a continental scale. And so that term refers to collectively the first indigenous inhabitants of the Americas. And so you can think, well, there would be all sorts of really good alternative terms for that. But the problem is that terms like Paleo and Paleo-American have both been kind of co-opted by these really like fringy groups that are very into this idea that, Europeans came over the Atlantic and colonized North America, or other much actually more conspiratorial ideas than that about the first people in North America. And so as a result, Paleoindian remains the kind of widespread term across North America. And we hope that despite it obviously seeming dated, that what it does is it emphasizes continuity across the whole continent. And so that all of these different places are really linked by this very impressive cultural phenomenon that is ancestral to the subsequent indigenous groups in North America. What is your take on all of this, Ken?
So basically the way you described it is sort of my thinking as well. And I think there's a couple things too. So first of all, to the listener, like we have the word spelled out in front of us, but when we talk about Paleoindians in North America, it's capital Palaeoindians. And so there's a couple things there. First is that instead of making it paleo with a dash Indian, you avoid the connotation of capitalizing Indian and kind of making it, the root, it is old Indians. You make it kind of a new word, Paleo-Indian, which is all pushed together. I use the AE as opposed to just EO for paleo, because AE by convention is a more North American reference. Paleo, Paleo, sort of connotes Paleolithic. So old world, so Europe and Asia and African subcontinents. And so basically all the same reasons for you as well, continuity with other regions, particularly in the Northeast and the far Northeast where we work. It's important to kind of use cohesive terminology because what we're viewing during the Paleoindian period that we'll be talking about today is one or many migrations of people making their way sort of into the continent and then across the continent very rapidly as part of this sort of like the first settlers of this new continent. And I think that terminology unites this sort of the first people of North America under one rubric, basically. And it also, I think in modern parlance, as we talked about in the first episode, it sort of encompasses both the first people like the pre-Clovis and then what we'll be talking about today, more Clovis and other descendants of later Paleo. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think the other thing that we should mention, so I'm in total agreement with you on all of that, is that there are in fact localized indigenous terms for Paleoindian people. So for instance, the folks at Debert have come up with terminology, but because we're trying to focus on this integrative approach and we're trying to encompass different groups of indigenous people that now occupy the Wabanaki homeland, we're not trying to preference any particular terminology and trying to emphasize those continuities. But we are absolutely referring to the ancestors of the contemporary indigenous people who occupy this place.
And we'll be including in the show notes reference to, like for example, the Mi'kmaq terminology, cultural historical terminology for the Eastern Maritimes region.
Absolutely. And so we're going to take a kind of excuse here to not talk about pre-Clovis, which is complicated and fraught. And we're going to say that here in the Northeast, the first archaeological evidence for people being here are descendant and related to Clovis. And so we're going to sort of frame this show around the idea that we're going to focus first on a kind of broad outline of Paleoindians in North America, beginning with Clovis. Then we're going to look at the New England Maritimes region, and then we're going to look at New Brunswick. So we're going to kind of funnel this down and hope that we don't lose the thread as we do that. But one thing we should warn the listener about is that it's a fascinating thing about Paleoindians is that the study of Paleoindians routinely makes otherwise sane people, otherwise sane archaeologists, just lose their minds. It's really fascinating. It's called olditis in the biz, and Ken and I were talking before the show, and in fact I've had somewhat limited experience on Paleoindian sites. I directed work one summer at so if you're gonna do one summer of Paleoindian research, it should probably be at the Michaud cluster. That was my attitude. It's this important cluster of Paleoindian sites in Maine. I worked at the LaMontagne site. But when I was doing this, I was on this really sweet health insurance plan through Bates College, it's an American college, well-to-do college. And so as a result, I was seeing my analyst during this 3 days a week. I'd cranked my Wellbutrin prescription up just through the roof. And I was also recording all sorts of information, biometrics, just to make sure that I was firmly keeping my boots on the ground during this. Because what happens sometimes is your archaeologists get into these into Paleoindian studies, and it's as if Captain Ahab had just nailed the silver dollar to the mast, and you are chasing that white whale, and come hell or high water, you're gonna find that white whale. So that's
And what is that white whale, Gabe?
That white whale, Ken, is a fluted point, and a fluted point is a point which is has a flake, so a conchoidal fracture that, as if you were to shoot a BB through glass, but it starts at the bottom of the point and goes towards the tip, and it shears off what's called a channel flake, and the result is a point that has, usually on both sides, a flute that's removed, and it goes from base to tip, rather than most lithic reduction, which goes side to side. And the flute is a fluted point is totally unique. Ken, you're the lithics guy, but I believe this is totally unique to North America, right?
So up until a few years ago, yeah. So this is so fluting is a uniquely North American technology, and so fluting of Paleoindian points up until actually just a few years ago was thought to be actually an exclusively North American technology. But there are only actually 3 places in the world where it's been found. And so there's the Paleoindian period in North America. And then a couple of years ago, they found evidence of fluting in Yemen and Oman from Neolithic sites between about 8,000 and 7,000 years ago, apparently.
No kidding.
And they don't look the same as Clovis points, right? Like these aren't like collaterally flaked or parallel flaked. And so what's unique about fluted points in North America is that these the projectile points, the bifaces that they're made on, are really elegantly made and have a very distinctive flaking pattern where all of the flakes are taken from the sides, meet almost at the middle, and they're almost parallel the whole way down the point. And then you strike this flute up the middle of them. The photos I've seen of these fluted points, these Neolithic fluted points from Oman and from the Arab world, basically are not as fancy as Clovis ones, and there's obviously no relationship between the two of them. This is sort of like an independent thing, but certainly North America, it's unique to North America. It's fairly unique in the world, and it is the first indication of fluting in all of the world, which is it's and so I think really it is still a kind of a uniquely North American technology, which is cool because it's among maybe the only technology that was sort of developed here first, I guess, like that wasn't sort of built on some other or similar patterns elsewhere in the world.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I had no idea that fluting ever occurred elsewhere. I'm gonna have to change my lecture notes now, actually.
So I had to actually correct myself during a class because I had a student ask me, is this the only place in the world where fluting has occurred? And I said, yeah, I think so. And I said, I think it's a uniquely North American thing. And then I did some research that evening, and like the next class I had to come back and say, so I was wrong up until about 2020. And there's this interesting article here. Let me just pull up.
And we'll throw this article in the show notes too, because this is incredibly cool. This could almost be a hit piece. It's that new.
I don't know if it's a hit. I don't know if it's that new. It's like 2020, okay. I think was, you just keep rolling. I'm going to pull it up here. I've got it in the wrong bookmark.
So while Ken is pulling this up though, I should say that the what we're going to then describe here as we're fitting those through, the reason we're talking about this fluted point technology is that the first fluted points in North America, the fluted points that people think about when they think about fluted points, are Clovis. And we talked a little bit last fortnight about the importance of establishing time depth in North America. And we mentioned that there were particular kinds of diagnostic projectile points that were discovered in association with old forms of fauna. So basically with Pleistocene megafauna, and that was really crucial to saying, well, humans were killing these Ice Age megafauna. Therefore, humans have been in North America for a really long time, since basically the end of the Ice Age.
Yeah, like a really important historical moment in the understanding of indigenous history in North America was that, you find a Folsom point embedded in a bison antiquus, it's you're older than 4,000 years right there.
Absolutely, yeah. And so and this actually really speaks to the sort of, we're going to lay out a framework for you here, a kind of temporal framework. And we're going to try to do this without pictures, which is tricky. But we're going to, throughout this, everything is going to be sort of hung on 3 time periods, which are named basically after forms of spear points. Okay, so this is points that are attached to spears, and probably, at least at first, very much used to hunt big mammals. And the first of these is Clovis, and Clovis is known for having a slightly shorter flute. That's that flake driven from base to tip. And then we get Folsom with a longer flute from base to tip. And then we get, at the very end of the Paleoindian period, around the continent, lancelet points. And these don't have those flutes, although occasionally they've got a little bit of playing around with the base.
Yeah, aggressively basally thinned, I believe, is Chris Ellis and David Black's terminology.
It's a fantastic term. I like it a lot.
Yeah.
But as a result, we're going to give you some more terminology for time related to these points as the show goes on and we narrow this down. But basically, one of the fascinating things about Paleoindians is that their mobility is in excess of what we would know for almost any ethnographically understood hunter-gatherer group. So as a result, these are ancestors of indigenous people that now inhabit the Wabanaki homeland, who are basically colonizing all of North America in a number of years that is in the hundreds rather than in the thousands. So very, very quickly. So as a result, we're going to talk about the region we're in as, we're going to use terms like Clovis derived or Folsom derived.
Clovis-like.
Clovis-like, these sorts of things. And what this just means is that we're using a local terminology for these groups that implies a slightly later occupation, but later in very relative, small terms, basically, that people are still moving from west to east, colonizing North America, and they're doing so very, very quickly.
Yeah. There's like a 300-year time lag between the beginning of classic Clovis and the beginning of Clovis-like in the far northeast, basically.
Yeah. Did you find that article, Ken?
I did. Yeah.
And
Fluted point technology in Neolithic Arabia, an independent invention far from the Americas. It's a plus one article by Remy Crassard, Vincent Charpentier, Joy McCorston, Jeremy Vosquet, Sofiane Bouzid, and Michael D. Petralia.
Fantastic. And that far from the Americas, I think, says all you need to know about where fluted points are known from.
Yeah, exactly.
And so when we're talking about Paleoindians, we're talking about the first, well understood colonization of North America. And so about 13,000 years ago, moving very rapidly across the Americas from the Northwest. And it's characterized by Clovis spear points, these fluted spear points we've talked about. And this hyperdiagnostic technology and hunting megafauna. So this is kind of the classic basic frame that we're going to build all of this on. These people have a classic toolkit, and this includes big scrapers, and it's got a variety of styles made from really nice rock. So, Ken's a rock guy, but I think it's actually better to hear this from a non-rock guy, which is that Paleoindians seem to really like nice rocks. Like, they like the kind of rocks that even I can make something that looks like a flake out of. Is that your sense too, Ken?
Yeah, they like pretty rocks, and as we talked about the first week, they seem to like red rocks. Nathaniel Kitchell has a paper out on this, but even Dean Snow in like 1980 was talking about how red chert might have been something to do with this the kind of connotations of blood in an animal hunt. So that there's some these high quality materials were attractive, probably because you need very good material to make these elaborately fluted points. But also there was definitely I think there was probably an aesthetic element to it. And there's definitely preferential materials in different time periods. So in Southern Ontario, they really, Paleoindians, particularly fluted point, and then up until basically sort of on the cusp of like lanceolate, but Paleoindians in general like Collingwood chert, which is this very a beautiful white chert, very fine grained and everything, but it's not used basically after the Paleo-Indian period. So it's almost diagnostic in Southern Ontario. So if you find Collingwood chert, it's probably Paleo.
Oh, that's very cool.
Yeah.
They there's the real Paleoindian enthusiasm though for high quality cherts seems to be a thing like throughout the continent though. I think that's fair to say.
Yeah, yeah, and even like, you know, homeland of Clovis, which, you know, in New Mexico where the type site is, all throughout North America, it's nice material. Like, so this was a thing that a group of people did have a real preference for.
And there's a possible fluted point made even on Ramachert from Labrador that was found in Vermont, I believe.
Oh, really? Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, it's a little dubious, you know, on the base, but it looks like a fluted point to me, and other people have suggested that as well. So in addition to these fluted points, it's the fluted point is the big diagnostic thing. And we should say we mentioned that occasionally Paleoindian makes archaeologists lose their minds. There's actually even a song about this. There's a popular song about this.
That's a great song too.
But by Tyler Childers, who's and the song's called Banded Clovis. And the Tyler Childers he's from Ohio, but he sort of purports to be a West Virginian, which is something you would do if you're from Ohio, which is, you know, maybe Ohio is probably the worst state in the United States. West Virginia's easily in the top 5. And so
if we had any listeners from Ohio before this episode, I think we've just lost them.
Yeah, we didn't have any listeners from Ohio.
We might have gained some West Virginians though.
Yeah, well, I should hope. The West Virginia Archaeological Society is welcome to chime in to sponsor this with a ringing endorsement from Tyler Childers. But Childers has this song called Banded Clovis, and it's about these looters who go out and one of the looters finds a point that I believe the quote is it's banded as hell. It was fluted in Clovis.
Yep.
Is that the line? Yeah. And then the other fellow that he's looting with kills him and takes the point. I think this is the premise of the whole country song.
Yep.
Which is that's a niche country song right there, but it's got a certain ring to it.
It's great teaching material too.
It is, yeah. You can rag the puck for a good 3.5 minutes on a class with that song. But there are other things in the kind of classic fluted point Paleoindian toolkit, and so these include big scrapers, which are also usually made on high quality stone, and that's likely for handling the hides from big mammals that people are killing with the projectile points. And there's also some other kind of interesting things. You get on some of the scrapers, you get spurs, and the reason that the spurs exist, these are little basically protrusion off the sides of the scrapers, and that may exist. There's all sorts of literature on this because people may get tired as they're scraping, and so as a result, the scrapers wear out more on one side than the other. Might relate to handedness. We don't really know. In addition to this, you get a material called limaces, which Ken, you're bilingual. I think means slug in French, doesn't it?
Yeah, this slug or a flake shaver or I think a burr is another name for them.
Yeah.
But yeah, they're this sort of slug shaped flake shavers. So they're basically a unifacial artifact that was kind of humpbacked and probably used and hafted, I think is the idea behind them. And so I think the large humpback, like the big scrapers, the big unifaces, I think were probably big enough to be used in hand. And then the thinking is the limaces were probably hafted. I think I've got that correct, don't I?
I think that's true. I think with Paleoindian material though, whether or not things were hafted is in the eye of the beholder. Everything seems so large that you sort of think, well, it must be hafted, you know?
Yeah, kind of cool thing about scrapers too. So in the Southeast, you have scrapers as part of this like sort of diagnostic Paleoindian toolkit, and then they disappear for like the rest of history until the contact period in the Southeast.
Oh, it's totally bizarre. Really?
You don't see like them as like sort of a part of toolkits. There's a line in like that Sassaman and Papatat textbook that basically they talk about that scrapers essentially like that are like the paleo style scrapers could disappear basically until contact.
Huh, that's totally wild because they remain a huge thing up here.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean,
and change in shape and form and everything as we'll talk about on the show. But yeah, but don't disappear like they do there apparently. So
yeah, that's really interesting. Huh. And in fact, we'll talk more about uniface technology at length, either the show after next or next show. We still haven't quite figured this out.
we'll even get back to spurred scrapers at some point.
We will. That's true. Yeah. So this, so stay tuned. You know, if you're still listening, even you Ohio listeners, we'll be
In
back
6 to 8 weeks. We'll be talking about spurred scrapers again.
Precisely. There are drills. Drills appear sometimes in Paleoindian toolkits. But one thing we should mention that I feel obliged to mention is that even though we associate and we mention that Paleoindians are associated with really high quality stone, really impressive tools, they also in the Northeast use junky local material to make choppers.
Basically, junky tools out of junky material, like heavy, stuff for chopping down trees or breaking bone and processing, probably as you're initially tearing apart a large mammal, you need a heavy tool for it. So
at the LaMontagne site, the stuff was called Christian Hill Diabase, and the source had been blown up to expand the airport. But the material, it looked like I've got family from New Jersey, and it looked like if you'd blown up their driveways. Essentially, you had created something out of the kind of tar cement stuff that they use in that part of the world to make driveways. So we've talked a little about the toolkit. We've talked a little bit about the people. We're going to narrow this down more. So to quickly kind of recap, we've got people who are probably big game specialists. They're using a very diagnostic toolkit, using high quality stone, and they are moving really, really rapidly to colonize North America from west to east. But we haven't talked much about the landscape. And so this period in time is the end of the last ice age, or the Pleistocene. So it's this transitional period, and this is going to be important when we talk about our more local region, but it's also sort of important for understanding broader trends in the region. So what we're looking at, I think, is, and kind of correct me here and nuance this, Ken, is that in a broad sense, we're going to lump Clovis and Folsom, the first two fluted point periods, together as being the end of the Ice Age. And
that's fair, yep.
We can lump that together even more narrowly as being part of the Younger Dryas, which is basically that as the Ice Age is ending, especially during Folsom, things get a little bit colder again.
Yeah.
So sort of you kind of get Paleoindian, then things get chilly and they get dry.
Yeah. And there's a little bit more nuance in there, in that traditional Clovis predates the Younger Dryas in like, the Southwest and in other parts of the continent. But when you get into the Northeast, Clovis begins at the start of the Younger Dryas. So there's about, like I'd mentioned earlier, this kind of 300-year lag. And so traditional Clovis starts around 13,200 years ago. The Younger Dryas starts around 12,900 years ago. And as we're sort of talking now for the next few minutes about sort of the Northeast New England Maritimes region, we're starting at around 12,900 years ago, which is the start of the Younger Dryas, and which terminates at around 11,600 years ago at the end of the Pleistocene, basically.
And I should direct the listener to Ken and Dave Black. Actually just had a chapter out in a book from Nimbus Publishing called The Last Billion Years. The Last Billion Years.
Yeah.
And it's fantastic. And it deals with a lot of this because it considers humans alongside the kind of geological information and the kind of environmental information Ken's just talking about. And it's a book that's really suitable for everybody too. So I think that's one of the many things. And it's also, the illustrations are fantastic. And one thing I would say is absolutely get the most recent one. You might be lured into some of the earlier ones, which were fantastic, but Ken and Dave's chapter really updates some of the stuff he was just talking about.
Yeah, we're so it's the last billion years, a geological history of the maritime provinces of Canada. So it's the second edition, just came out last year. Rob Fensom and Graham Williams are the editors. And this was, Dave and I played a very small part in 2 chapters toward the end of the book. But if you want to learn basically where the Maritimes, all of our rocks come from, how our part of the continent was formed, the life that was here well before humans, and then toward the end of it, they contextualize the human history, and so Dave and I had the opportunity to contribute to a couple chapters toward the end, which is really great. I mean, there was archaeology in the original version, and so this is basically we got a couple extra pages to add this time to provide a little bit of extra context. So, but yeah, fantastic book, and I've told this story a few times to Gabe and others that this was a book that I read when I was like, I don't know, in early high school years. And so it was in the first edition. And so it's something that, like, even for those of you in grade school, makes a fantastic Christmas gift or birthday gift for the young rock hound among us.
I was just going to plug that in. And the other thing is the illustrations are really, really high quality in that book.
They are.
Including of one of New Brunswick's oldest Paleoindian points, which we'll return to.
Yes, that's true.
Later in the show. So what we've got then is a situation where, we might as well just sort of pivot local now to the New England Maritimes area. And that's a clunky formulation, I realize. But basically what that is denoting is that it seems like throughout New England and the maritime provinces of Canada, there's no evidence for Paleoindians in Newfoundland, that we've got this basically sort of shared cultural formulation for the Paleoindian period, where people are interacting across this enormous distance. It's a kind of shared cultural thing that's going on. What the environment probably would have looked like during this period, it would have been really dynamic. So it would have been changing a lot. It's probably a sort of tundra-like environment. And as people moved around, this is actually why I left Fredericton today, was that this region would have had remnant ice caps, much like downtown Fredericton has in this wonderful wonderful day. But the glaciers were retreating, and Ken, I feel bad putting you on the spot about this, but would you like to explain isostatic rebound to the listener?
Well, so basically, at one point, probably I think up to about 14,000 years ago, most of the Maritimes was covered in, what was it, like over a kilometer of ice or something like that?
The Wisconsin glaciation, right?
Yeah. So the Wisconsin glaciation reached its peak. Our part of the Wisconsin glaciation is the Laurentide ice sheet, which covered basically all of continental North America from the Rockies east, and covered south down to about probably like Virginia, like West Virginia area, or did it get that far down?
Yeah, I'm squinting at the map in my mind, and
below the Great Lakes, certainly.
Yeah. There's a fascinating tangent about this, which at this year's ESAF meeting, I learned that there are some extremely dubious, essentially unbelievable ideas about when, like, Pennsylvania and West Virginia and Ohio were deglaciated, enough that made me enough that made me basically not believe the Mid-Atlantic maps on this stuff.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I sort of remember this looking at the other archaeologists. Don't hold me to this, listener, but this may be a Hakuna Errata next show. But someone said something like that there were places in, I think, Pennsylvania that weren't de-iced until 4,000 years ago, and that's impossible. That can't be right. That
can't be right. No.
Yeah.
I mean, even in the Maritimes, which had the Younger Dryas ice re-advance, I think all the ice was gone by like 9,000 years ago.
Yeah, exactly right. And so we
Probably before
questioned,
that.
yeah. And we questioned this during the session, and it turns out that there are actually like legit geological and environmental models that suggest this. They must just be incorrect.
Huh. That is interesting.
Yeah.
So I'm actually
Even at
looking at
altitude, it seems impossible.
I am looking at an ice margin map right now. And it looks like actually that the max, like, so the peak glaciation would have covered down to below the Great Lakes, but probably hovering right around kind of like a straight line between like Pennsylvania and sort of like Maryland. So let's just say at the Potomac, is that what drains out in Maryland?
Among others, yeah. I think this is what William Gardner, who worked at the Thunderbird Paleoindian site in Virginia, called the biotic Mason-Dixon line.
Oh, that would, there you go. That's a little bit more eloquent than me kind of umming and ahhing about what's going on.
I think it's a great phrase. Anyway, I like the phrase.
Yeah. So getting back to isostatic rebound, though. So picture over a kilometer of ice sitting on rock, and that rock is sitting on a plastic surface, which is magma underneath the North American tectonic plate. And so as that ice melts, it lets off water, but it's also getting lighter. And so over time, basically what happens is that the more that the ice that melts, there's more water going streaming off of it, but the weight that is pressing down on the continental ice shelf releases. And so you have basically a shift where for a time you have high levels of water because you have water melting rapidly. And so you have the formation of you have what are called marine incursions. And so parts of central New Brunswick, basically up into really like past Fredericton, would have been under, and you know, most of sort of the Grand Lake region would have been under a much larger marine incursions, this body of water that kind of came inland. And then over time, what happens is that water comes down in a flash very quickly. And then starting at around, 12,000 or so years ago, that water starts to drop down again, and the continent springs back up, basically, because the weight that has been sitting on it, all that ice, has been let off, and the continent starts to rise back up. And so you have a really dramatic change where you have ice melting and then a huge influx of water. Basically, the ocean comes up very high, and then that drops down, and the land rises up again, and the water levels drop very low again. And so you have changing landscapes all around. And in particular, this is pertinent to Paleoindians because at the time that they were moving into the Atlantic Northeast, there was basically more land available for them to live in than we would see today.
And another reason that it's significant archaeologically is that this means that, it's something on the order of a 50-meter difference about where, there would have been about
vertical difference.
Sorry. Yeah, exactly. So there would have been, if there were coastal Paleoindian occupations, they would be substantially underwater now.
Yeah.
Along with this, there's all sorts of things that happen to watercourses on the interior. So one of the things that happens is many things that are now swamps were glacial lakes. So you get this sort of change from lake to swamp. You get changes in where watercourses go and meander and how big they are. And so it's this period of really also rapid change. That's, I think, another important point, is that the landscape is changing really, really quickly in this region.
Yeah, and so it some kind of, you have this sort of marine incursion, and in the Maritimes and in central New Brunswick, for example, you have this kind of interesting situation where you have an influx of ocean water at first, but then you have because of isostatic rebound, the water that's sitting in sort of central New Brunswick, as the land rises up, gets trapped in there as the Bay of Fundy drops down. And so you have the formation of what are called proglacial lakes, or these sort of stranded meltwater bodies that are a mix of marine water and fresh water runoff from melting glaciers. And so you have the formation of what's called Glacial Lake Acadia, which is, sort of this ancestral lake for the string of lakes that dot the lower reaches of Wolastoq River, forming for at least like 3,000 or so years, coinciding with when Paleoindian groups were in the region.
And so the knock-on effect of all this is that the analogy everybody always uses for thinking about Paleoindian landscapes is basically the subarctic. And there's some problems with that because you don't necessarily want to think about the Paleoindian period as being equivalent to subarctic people, because subarctic people have been, by the time we know them in the ethnohistoric record, Stephen Loring's talked about this, by the time we hear about subarctic people in the ethnohistoric record, they've been forced off the coast, right? Because by Europeans, essentially.
Yeah.
So it's possibly a very different life way, and it's not one that's directly applicable. But in terms of just a kind of landscape, if you're to imagine the landscape thinking about the subarctic, you're not going to be far off in the sort of what fluted point Paleoindian we're living on. And you'll be pretty close. So it's colder. You've got different kinds of
low shrubs.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so as this is all happening, one of the things that the Maritimes is known for is this extremely important Paleoindian site. And it's called the Debert site. It's in Nova Scotia. My connection to the Debert site is that I almost wrecked or was part of wrecking a minivan filled with column samples of shell from a Woodland period shell heap essentially at the Debert site. We'd pulled off to fuel up. The van was somewhat overloaded. I told the joke to the driver. We very nearly rolled it. It would have been interesting to have the two of us in a shell midden and a minivan in this site. Very grateful that didn't happen. And but the Debert site is one of these. It's not the earliest period of site known from the region, but it's among the earliest sites known from the region. And it's one of these kind of big clusters of sites. And so we should talk for a minute here about the phenomenon of site clustering. So we mentioned that and to
give the listeners just a range, Debert was occupied averages out to around 12,600, but falls into a period between about 12,700 and 12,200 years ago.
Fantastic, and those are real years too. So
those are calendar years. We're gonna focus on using calendar years in our podcast broadcast, so that we do not lead the listener astray by throwing out random radiocarbon dates that aren't calibrated.
And so just while we're on the subject of dates, actually, because we're about to go down this rabbit hole of dates and naming these time periods in more narrow ways than we probably should, we should say that there's extreme difficulty in dating Paleoindian sites. And that's for a variety of reasons. But basically, you'll remember from last episode that radiocarbon dating works on things that have died. So the classic example is wood charcoal. So you burn some wood, it preserves, it can date the death of the tree. The Paleoindian sites are old. They're often in very sandy soil matrices.
I believe you explained your summer at La Montagne is playing in the sandbox, actually.
It was really fantastic, actually. You essentially throw the sand in the screen. You barely shake the screen. You kind of kick the screen, you pull the artifacts out, and then you do it again. The only tricky part is that the walls keep caving in on your excavations if you're not careful. So you just keep an eye on that. But they're mostly in these fantastic soils, but there are very few features, and features are what archaeologists call immovable artifacts. So things like house floors, hearths,
fire pits.
Fire pits.
A hearth is a fire pit. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, are pretty rare in Paleoindian sites. So as a result, we have very few good radiocarbon absolute dates on Paleoindian sites. We do have some, though, and many of these sites, many of these dates are from burned bone. We've got some burned bone, and then others are from some of these bigger sites, such as actually Debert, which had some fairly identifiable features. From these dates, what archaeologists have done, and especially, and we'll put this in a link to this in the show notes, but Bradley and colleagues in Archaeology of Eastern North America use these absolute dates to devise a point typology for New England and the Maritimes region. What this point typology does is it looks at what are actually pretty small nuances in the changes in Paleoindian points. So things like the length of the flute, the depth of the basal concavity, whether or not there is a flute or not, to try to put in approximate order a series of types. Yeah. And these types are each named for sites. Most of them are named for 2 sites.
Yeah. So we're going back to what Gabe was talking about before, where you've got the Clovis being the fluted points, Folsom being the deeper fluted points, and then Plano being these unfluted points. So like the like Jethro Tull without Ian Anderson, basically.
So the listener can't see that Ken just checked his notes for that joke. I'm just gonna go ahead and add him on that. Yeah. Cue the tall note. And these point types are in sequence, though. I'm gonna name them just because why not? The first one, Kings Road Whipple. The next one, Vale Debert. The next one, Bull Brook, West Athens Hill. And those are the earliest ones. Those are equivalent, if you hear those terms, those are your Clovis-like or your Clovis-derived.
Yeah, and that ranges from 12,900 to 12,200 years ago.
Exactly. And then your next ones are your Micho-Neponset. This one kind of cheats because it's just got the one site. Your Crowfield related.
Which is a site in Southern Ontario, actually.
Yeah, so which the astute listener will notice is not in the Maritimes or in New England. And then your Cormier Nicholas, and those are your Folsom-like points, your Middle Paleoindian points.
And that is ranging from 12,200 to 11,600. So at the end of this is the end of the Middle Paleoindian period, which is the end of the Younger Dryas as well, and also the end of the Pleistocene.
That's right. And so and then we switched to our lancelet forms with no fluting or occasionally aggressively
basally thinned.
Fantastic. Yep. And these are your agate basin related, and these refer to St. Anne Varney points, which are your unfluted or Plano-like points, if you're thinking about this in a broad continental term. For my purposes, I tend to think about fluted point Paleoindian merging the middle and the late, at the middle and the early. And then I tend to think about late Paleoindian referring to the lancelets.
And so, Gabe, the listener might be wondering, why flute a point?
Ken, I thought you'd never ask. We just leave this here as a pause, right? The answer is nobody knows. So I'm glad you brought that up. Nobody knows why flute a point. In addition to that, we don't know how exactly Paleoindians fluted points. We know that contemporary flint nappers can flute points. They often do it through direct percussion, so basically hitting the base of the point hard.
Yeah.
But they also have a variety of other complicated methods, which I think you've looked into recently.
Yeah,
Ken, am I right?
There's this chest punch method where you basically put an anchor, a very long rod basically in your chest, and you kind of heave down and try to shove off a point. But yeah, for the most part, it basically takes a lot of prep work. You prepare a very clean platform, which is basically you're setting up like a place to make contact between your percussor and your stone, because essentially you have like
your percussor. I'm going to walk you back just for a second. When you say percussor,
so you're probably using a piece of antler. In this case, or you could use rock as well, but in most demonstrations of this and most of what I've read about is that if you're going to try to flute a point, you'll probably use antler. So an antler billet, so some piece of moose or deer antler that you've carved into kind of with a butt end. You'll prepare this platform so you're going to prepare a place to strike and you kind of have like one go at this, which makes it kind of all the more interesting why people did this. And I think we talk about Bull Brook in here about like what they're doing in the circle?
But it's not in our show outline. As you can tell, listener, Ken and I have carefully prepared the notes for this. We scanned the same cocktail napkins to one another before this. But no, we don't. But you kind of raised this point that you said you get one go at it. It's easy to screw this up, right? This is contemporary flint knappers report that frequently you get this beautiful point, and the last step you do is you go to drive this flake from base to tip off, and you snap the thing in two, because it's very hard to do. Even with a complicated rig like the crutch described that you're going to hit with your chest, when the point's in a vise, it's still pretty easy to break. And so at Bull Brook, which is an important Paleoindian site in Massachusetts, so in the New England Maritimes region, and this is, you'll recall, because I know you all were taking careful notes on this, this is one of the earlier Paleoindian occupations. There's this really, really fascinating site. And this site has really precise spatial patterning. It was worked on by Brian Robinson and colleagues. And they identified that there were essentially tight areas at this site. So walk back one step here, that there were, first of all, this site was probably an aggregation site where groups of families came together. And this is due to the large number of probably contemporaneously inhabited houses. And you may be like, well, okay, you just said you don't have features. And that's true, but what you do get is you get artifact patterning in basically round patterns that seems like there were structures around where people were working on these artifacts.
And these artifact patterns are like, right in the size of what like what type of houses that you would expect people to live in, even later in time. So they're 4 to 6 meters and around there. They look like they're basically probably nuclear families, or maybe a little bit bigger than that in some cases. And so it is really interesting that this particular site is really fascinating to look at, how they've mapped out all this patterning.
Yeah, and Brian, in a series of articles, sort of explored why are the activities within this area, within this aggregation site, so seemingly patterned, right? And so, for instance, you get spaces where it seems like people are fluting points. You get spaces where it seems like people are using scrapers. And so Brian's interpretation of this, using a number of ethnographic analogies, involved gender, that there were very tightly prescribed gendered spaces. But one of his other, I think, particularly interesting hypotheses about this kind of patterning was this idea of a fluting shaman. So that there might actually be, as part of this preparation for going out hunting, this sort of activity where the actual fluting of the point was an important, basically, ritual activity before going on a hunt. And I think one thing just about hunter-gatherers in general that's I find very intriguing, and we've talked about this before, Ken, is that it's when we think about the hunt, right? If we think about, if you're going to just watch like an ethnographic documentary, the temptation to treat the hunt as a thing in which, a bunch of dudes with a spear go out and kill something is not how actually most hunter-gatherers conceive of hunting.
Yeah.
In the ethnographic literature, they mostly conceive of hunting as really this much more sort of ongoing process in which the animals are essentially often giving themselves up to the hunter. And so as a result, that's got all sorts of interesting implications. And so for the Cree, which is the analogy everyone uses for this, and the reason that everyone uses this analogy is because Adrian Tanner wrote a brilliant book called Bring Home Animals that everybody should read. But basically that there are all sorts of things that happen just on day-to-day life that you need to worry about to make sure that the animals will continue to give themselves up to the hunter. So the way in which people organize their houses is really, really important. There's all sorts of gendered patterning about this. Like Tanner's got that great diagram. You probably remember this, but about you need to be a little bit careful because there's all these gender prescriptions about bears, and you want to make sure that bears and women because they're both precisely gendered. Because bears are so gendered in the ethnographic literature, you just slide the bear under the tent flap rather than through the door, because you don't want women and bears in the same door. Once you get the bear in there, you've got to make sure that different parts of the bear, the male parts of the bear are aligned in the male parts of the tent. The women's parts of the bear are aligned in the women's parts of the tent. You need to be careful not to step over them. So there's all this patterning going on. And so as a result, you can imagine the situation, and Brian really lays out this situation. Brian's the one who turned me on to Adrian Tanner's book, actually. So I've got a tremendous fond spot for this whole thing. But basically saying that, well, it would make sense that there would be at a big aggregation site where everyone's on their best behavior because all these families have come together, and we're hunting all these caribou that probably come to this place in a very predictable way. And so what we're doing is we've really precisely sorted out how we're going to act. And that means that this fluting shaman thing needs to be in a particular place, because we got to do this right tonight so that the caribou will behave the way we want them to tomorrow.
Yeah, you can tell Gabe is the domestic space archaeologist here on the podcast. That's great. That, and actually, it's really important to understand this context. And so this is one of the things that I've had a lot of questions from my students when they read this article is, how is it that he can make these interpretations about gender based on just like patterning and stone tools, and then you have to kind of wind things back, and you get an opportunity to introduce this whole notion of ethnographic analogy that we use in archaeology. That's sort of as Gabe has mentioned a few times, that a lot of what we understand about Paleo-Indians is derived from sort of contemporary and probably 19th and early 20th century ethnographic studies of hunter-gatherers living in cold environments, basically.
And one place to actually, if you're thinking about these sorts of topics, there's a great ethnographic film that's available online. It's from the National Film Board of Canada, and it's called The Cree Hunters of Mistassini. Fantastic film, and completely recommend it for this. Yeah.
And actually, you can watch it online now. Like almost all these NFB films are streamable online. So.
Yeah, and it's just terrific about this stuff. It's got this great line in it. The one of the things that's going on here is that it's the shared hunting territory in maybe the 60s or 70s, and there's all sorts of patterning about how they handle animal remains. And so there's this fellow tying up beaver remains in a tree, and the interviewer basically says they're talking Cree, why are you doing that? And he says something like, that's what we've always done. And I think that's like this, fantastic idea that there could be this sort of time depth of this stuff, but also this fantastically human moment at which you're trying to reflect on why do we do it this way? And the answer is essentially culture, which I think is kind of great.
Habitus.
Yeah.
Tradition.
Absolutely. Yeah. The fantastic. And so we should just kind of summarize then maybe quickly the way in which it seems like Paleo-Indians are living in the Maine Maritimes region before we move on specifically to New Brunswick, which we're leaving very little time for New Brunswick, but there's a reason for that.
You'll notice that there's sort of diminishing information the further north we get.
It's true. We've mentioned one site in Nova Scotia for the up and over effect. And but so what's going on here is we mentioned that Paleoindians are probably big game specialists. So in the far northeast, in the New England Maritimes region, big game equals caribou. And caribou are really, really fascinating. And Arthur Spies, Maine State archaeologist, important and really, really interesting work on Paleoindians. But before that was a kind of caribou hunter guy in general, interested in this. And I read his book, and I thought to myself, I'd always thought the mystery about caribou hunters was the people. It turns out the mystery is also the caribou. There are all sorts of things we don't know about caribou, including, like how exactly they decide when to move, how they can detect hunters, all these kinds of things. caribou herds are more complicated than I certainly would have thought. But one of the things that we know about caribou is that you can say, well, yeah, they're following caribou, but they're not really following caribou. Caribou move too quickly. So they're intercepting caribou at places they know caribou are going.
Yeah. And caribou, just to scale it back here, caribou are fundamentally like migratory and large mammals, right? You know, that they sort of move in semi-predictable large aggregations between they sort of have spring and fall movements to sort of favored patches of lichen, I'm guessing, and other resources.
Yeah, and potentially to remnant ice caps where there are no bugs.
Yep.
Turns out this is a place you maybe would intercept them. Our Brian Robinson and Bert Pelletier did some work on this and basically said, you know, and the premise would be that at a place like Brook, where we're talking about, the landscape is such that it would be easier to predict where they were there, but it would happen less often. Whereas you could go further north, and caribou are hanging out on these relatively bug-free, icy areas where you can have some degree of success hunting them. We know that one of the kinds of migrations that we're talking about for Northeast Paleoindians, and we're about to caveat this, are over 400 kilometers. So we're talking about people moving over these massive areas on a seasonal basis. But, intrepid listener, you may be about to ask, how do they know that? And the reason we know that is pegged extensively to one particular kind of rock. And that rock is called Munsungan chert, and it's from far northern Maine. Have you been to? I don't think
I haven't been up to Munsungan yet. I haven't had a chance to take in one of these field trips.
So I went last summer, and to give the listener some sense of what it's like, you drive to Presque Isle, Maine, the bustling metropolis that is Presque Isle, Maine. Spend the night in Presque Isle, and then you go on for a while, and you end up in basically Ashland, Maine. And you stop in at a mill, and you speak to the fellow there that handles the woods road, and he then directs you to another person who handles the woods road, and then you drive for about 6 miles, and your cell phone cuts out, and 50 miles later you end up at the field camp where the archaeologists are working. And so we stayed with the Salve Regina Field School, who were out there for a lot of time in a very rustic location. And the reason they're there is that Nathaniel Kitchell and Heather Rockwell just identified the quarry a few years ago for the kind of the gourmet Paleoindian chert.
And not just Paleoindian, like the stuff that you see in the late Woodland as well, like the really nice red variant of this silicified mudstone that we call chert.
Yeah, even Ken calls it red, and he can't see the color red, which is but it's the Christmas tree is the phrase they use, right? It's like it's kind of a green grading to red, material often, and this stuff appears over throughout the Maritimes, New England region. So now we had 2 caveats. The first caveat is that this fellow named Speth at the University of Michigan has pointed out that the actual amount of chert that appears at Paleoindian sites is something like 2 backpacks worth. So it's not like we've got a huge amount of this stuff. So it's possible a couple of guys are hauling up to Munsungan every once in a while and returning with enough chert for a generation. So that's one possibility. Rather than the whole group's moving, we might be having some sort of direct procurement going on.
Yeah.
The other problem is that it's become increasingly apparent that actually telling Munsungan chert from a few varieties of New York chert is really, really difficult. So there are kinds of Norman scale chert that look an awful lot like Munsungan chert, and you're looking concerned, Ken. I hope this isn't torpedoing.
No, this is the XRF study they did a couple years ago, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's XRF. It's also just visually the stuff is alarmingly similar. a mutual colleague and friend of ours, Zach Singer, who's a Paleoindian guy. He's not a Paleoindian guy, he's a Paleoindian researcher from and he works in Maryland now, but did a lot of work in Connecticut. Posted, I think, to his Instagram a picture of from the source Munsungan beside from the source Normanskill, and invited the viewer to try to tell which was which.
Yeah.
And it was not comforting for any of us, I don't think.
No, and this is, I mean, we have the same issues in New Brunswick. So there's Carboniferous cherts from South Central New Brunswick, the stuff that I study, that also occur in northern New Brunswick, and in small pieces look almost indistinguishable from material from Nova Scotia.
Yeah. And so that's how we interpret this big, long range. And we've talked about some of the problems with Paleoindian sites, and this continues to be a problem in this area where they are shallowly buried. They're often on soils that are deposited by glacial runoff. There's not many plants during the Younger Dryas, and so the soils are probably these like windblown dunes that made nice sheltered landforms. And then only later do these get secured by vegetation once the climate gets warmer. And we find Paleoindian sites generally at places where there are good views of what were watercourses back then. So we've got this complicated model for understanding Paleoindian sites, which is that you need to, if you're looking at, say, more recent sites, you can typically say, well, the landscape's about like it was. It's not really true for Paleoindian sites. You need to think about them in terms of these other factors.
Yeah, you need to be sort of a more than casual geologist to really get at where Paleoindian people were living, and have more than just a cursory knowledge of superficial geology, because quaternary geology in particular, so late Pleistocene, early Holocene geological processes, to really understand the kinds of landscapes and understand, first of all, the formation, and so when these sort of landscapes would be available, and whether they persisted after Paleoindian groups would have been there. So there are places, for example, where we talked about the Younger Dryas, and there are landscapes in New Brunswick that would have been ice-free when the Paleoindians were in the region. But during the Younger Dryas, or when the Paleoindians were coming in, I guess, and then during the Younger Dryas, for 1,500 years or so, the area was recovered with ice. And so there's absolutely almost no chance of finding stuff from that time period in some areas, because I had a geologist explain to me that if they were here, it would have, you'd find it in a fine paste in this till layer, basically. So that, this stuff would be crushed and ground by a glacier. And so understanding these past landscapes is really important for understanding where Paleoindian people would have lived and doing the archaeology.
And that massively changing landscape also creates, I think, one of the most interesting aspects of Paleoindian settlement, which is that it's this phenomenon of Paleoindian site clustering.
Yeah.
And so typically Paleoindian sites occur in clusters where there are a bunch of sites around one landform, and the sites don't perfectly overlap. And so we've talked about one that I worked at, which is the Little Montaigne site. The Little Montaigne site is part of the Michoud cluster, which is around the Lewiston-Auburn Airport. This is actually, it turns out that Paleoindian site locations are also very good for municipal airports.
Yeah.
This is a strange fluke of geology. But so there are a series of sites located, basically clustered around that airport, and they're in the same approximate location, but they're a kilometer, half a kilometer apart from one another. What it seems like is probably happening is that the landscape is changing so rapidly that there's a bunch of good reasons to keep coming back to that approximate area, but the ideal place to camp will change slightly over time. And so you end up with these, through a few generations, you end up with a bunch of sites in approximately the same area.
Yeah, and because we have such difficulty with dating these sites, we also have really poor resolution about how, we don't even have sort of generational overlap in a lot of these dates. We have ranges of, couple hundred years in these clusters. And I guess maybe Michaud's a little bit different, but I think like Debert, Belmont, they overlap, but they don't there's no clear contemporaneity other than looking at the types of stone tools that they were using. We can say, well, this fits into a broad period of 500 to 600 years when we know these groups were using this sort of tool.
Yeah, and in general, I mean, contemporaneity is like really difficult in archaeology because radiocarbonates don't work at the same scale that hunter-gatherers lived.
Yeah.
So and that'll be a recurring theme in this podcast, I suppose, or this podcast series. And it seems like there are probably also aggregation sites that occur at places where people would have intercepted caribou. So different family bands coming together, maybe to intercept caribous. And this is in some part a riff on these big Pleistocene kill sites that we get out west, where groups of Paleoindians came together to kill a bunch of caribou and process them and eat a whole bunch of them. We get, like Folsom's known for this out west.
Like bison kill sites.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So is this scaled down for caribou? That's sort of the model that we have out here. And then, so that sort of talks about fluted point Paleoindian. And then there's the big problem that, in a cultural historical term, late Paleoindian happens. There's the environmental change from the Younger Dryas to climate that starts to be much more similar to what we have now. And then things change. And then archaeologists don't know what happens. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I think it's pretty, like, people, they stop fluting their points, and then for a while they make things that sort of look like fluted points, and then they start notching their points, and this all kind of happens somewhere between 11,600 and 9,000 years ago. There aren't a ton of sites that we found for around that time period. And yeah, there's a whole lot of ambiguity about what's happening. Is it population change? Is it, are there new people coming in, or is it just new ideas? Is it sort of a dramatic response to, the fundamental changes going on around you, and so people are kind of negotiating changes in their worlds? It's a confusing time archaeologically. And for a time, I guess we'll get to this, we even thought people weren't here for a few thousand years.
That's true, and that's going to be a big theme next fortnight, I think.
Yeah,
it's going to be this kind of great hiatus, this idea that there was this big chunk of missing time in the region. One thing we do know about late Paleoindian is that it appears like things become much more local. So if the theme of fluted point Paleoindian is a shared continental culture, these big kind of cultures, it seems like we start to see more specialization in late Paleoindian. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, and I think it's the materials get to be, like, lithic material gets to be more localized. I mean,
Yeah.
Despite this though, like Agate Basin style lanceolate points in Alberta look almost identical to, Micho Nippon, or what are they, St. Anne Varney lanceolate points in the New England Maritimes region, and
yeah.
we found a lanceolate point in southern Ontario that looks almost identical to what you'd see in like New England.
Yeah.
So there is still this shared idea about how you make your tools, but I guess it's that we're not, going 400 kilometers or so to get the rock.
Yeah, or only sometimes doing that, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. So should we talk about New Brunswick?
I think we should. Yeah.
All right.
The coda on late Paleoindian is that the story continues.
Yeah, exactly. And the story continues, and it overlaps with next week. I guess that we can foreshadow that there's this, that's one of the problems.
And I'm gonna just put a teaser out there. People didn't leave.
Dun dun dun. So we're gonna now turn to New Brunswick, which is gonna be a short part of this. It's a mutual friend and colleague of ours, Ken, Imby Fox, the great archaeologist from Toronto, who works on a lot of mathematical stuff. She told me that her partner said that these are called sodes in the biz, like apostrophe SODES,
Like
rather than eps.
episodes?
We've been calling them eps, yeah, but apparently they're sodes.
This is like how I called Instagram the gram for a while, and I learned that it's actually supposed to be called Insta.
Oh, I've still been doing that wrong, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, this is the shorter part of the sode or the ep or whatever this is. So what we should say, I guess, is where does New Brunswick fit in this? And we basically suspect that New Brunswick is the same as the New England Maritimes model we've described in general. For a long time, most of what we knew about New Brunswick Paleoindians, and this fits with, if you were to say, what do we know about Maine Paleoindians in the 1970s? We knew that Paleoindians were there, but we knew that mostly from find spots, which is that people, mostly avocational, would occasionally find these incredibly diagnostic fluted points and report them. And so this in New Brunswick,
you have a line actually that I think we didn't actually mention at the start. So Gabe said diagnostic, and so when you find a fluted point, you have a really great note here that these are actually hyper diagnostic. Like, we talked at the start of the show that like there might actually be another spot in the world where people made fluted points, but if you find a fluted point in North America, there is no other time period in 13,000 plus years of history here. If you find one of these, you're talking very old stuff, which is really fascinating.
That hybrid diagnostic line, I think that's a Brian Robinson line from a review of archaeology article.
Oh, nice. Okay.
Yeah, contrasting it with pre-Clovis, with what you might expect for pre-Clovis. And the premise of the article is that it's almost unfair to expect that pre-Clovis would be something equivalent to Clovis, because Clovis occurs like once, it's, there are, the old phrase, like people talk about projectile points, say there's only so many ways to skin a cat, and it's true, but they really only skinned it that way, for a little while. But so we strongly suspect from these find spots, just like we did in Maine, that there's no reason to imagine that Paleoindian in New Brunswick is any different than it is anywhere else. And these find spots have been at places like Kingsclere, at Quaco Head, at New Norton Creek, at the Northwest Miramichi. You point out there's probably a Holcomb-esque point in the George Frederick Clark collection. And is this on maybe Washtemowick? Yeah,
possibly made on Carboniferous chert that looks like Washtemowick chert. For various reasons, probably not coming from Bellier's Cove, because as I talked about earlier, Bellier's Cove was probably underwater at around that time, under glacial Lake Acadia waters, basically. But we do know, some of my research has indicated that there are other places where you could get chert that looks almost identical to Washtemowick chert that would have been above the water at that time. So maybe on a kind of a high point overlooking a much bigger lake at that time in the past. And and there's other places like in the Petitcodiac. What's interesting too is if you look at like the patterning of where all these find spots are found, they're mostly almost all in the southern part of the province. I don't think anything's been found north of like the Northwest Miramichi, like the Big Clearwater sort of, that's in central New Brunswick. And
do you think that's real patterning, or do you think that's population?
I don't know. I guess it could be a population thing. I just mean that like if you look at it on a map, you've got Maine, all the Maine Paleoindian sites, and then you got Debert, and then you've got kind of like a straight line of people finding points across southern New Brunswick. And some of that may be an environmental thing. I don't know. Like you definitely had remnant ice in northern parts of the province, and certainly ice re-advancing during the Younger Dryas down into places like even in like Napadogan and Juniper area, you'd have an ice margin around that area. And so that there may have been limited space for people to be at that time too. We just don't have a clear picture.
The listener may have just caught my aspirated yes there, as promised earlier, that they gonna take your.
Want to practice that one again? I think it's part of your residency requirements. So.
And so when we were in graduate school, 2010 or
2010, 2009 to 11.
Is that when Darcy found the Penfield site?
It was while we were in grad school, because I remember taking a road trip down there.
Yes. And so we're now shifting into, so can I say that we're now shifting into pretty much the realm of stuff that's not published and we know only by impressions.
Yeah.
And you, listener, might wonder what your taxpayer dollars are going for. And Ken and I might say you would be correct to wonder about that. So
yeah, there's been some conference papers and a couple of short reports, but we haven't seen kind of a big publication on Penfield or any of the other. There's another site, Marysville, that was excavated a few years ago as well, that has a short technical report that we can draw some inferences from, but the big picture is still kind of out there to be said.
Yeah, so Penfield's in Charlotte County, New Brunswick, so basically kind of coastal. It's near St. Andrews.
Excellent pie there, actually.
Oh,
McKay's Pies. They have a blueberry stand in Penfield that has possibly the best blueberry pies I've ever eaten.
Holy cow!
And I've eaten an entire blueberry pie from McKay's on the drive between Penfield and Fredericton. That's
impressive.
I couldn't do that now. But
I find myself more able to do that now than I used to be. Just less able to fit into my sweater the next day. What do we actually know about the Penfield site?
It's on a high point. It's kind of an odd location. It's not even really all that nice of a location for like a characteristic site for a Paleoindian site. Like it's not like a big, well-drained, like kind of outwash deposit. But it is at a high point and probably would have been fairly close to the edge of the water at that time. It is located close to a stream that probably would have been running. It's kind of a deeper gully now. There's some local lithic material that was available, but probably not used during Paleoindian times. We know that there's a transitional archaic component at the site. That
which
local
fits
material
with Paleoindian, actually,
which does fit with
yeah.
So by knowledge of the transitional archaic site, we know that there's also I don't know in terms of diagnostic tools. I know that like the original site find, Darcy, I think, was walking through an area. So this was during the Route 1 bypass. So they were twinning the highway between St. John and St. Stephen. And basically the developer had gone out and had prepped an area that had actually not been surveyed yet. And so Darcy Dignam went out, was called up to go out and survey the area, and was walking around. And the story goes that he was on his phone.
With Jesse Webb, wasn't he?
With Jesse Webb. And I think shouted a curse word or something. And under his boot was or near his toe, just before he stepped on it or something, was a Munsunken chert spurred scraper. I think isn't that
that's
how
my
the story goes?
recollection. Yeah, that's
so like a very diagnostic Paleoindian artifact made on distinctive fine grained chert from northern Maine, which you find on a lot of Paleoindian sites in the Maine Maritimes region, and certainly a very interesting find. And there was a fairly large mitigation excavation project done there in the subsequent summer, put on by the New Brunswick Archaeology Branch, the Provincial Archaeology Branch. I think that focused mostly on the transitional archaic component. The province actually shifted the highway design so that they were able to avoid the main occupation where the Paleoindian site was. They also found a late woodland site there as well.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that.
Ramachurt and a small late woodland campsite. So an interesting landscape, but certainly one that we'll hopefully find out more about in the coming years.
Yeah, and we should make clear that Darcy and Jesse and those folks were just involved in the initial finding of the site, not actually the subsequent.
Yeah, not the subsequent mitigation. Yeah.
And to their credit, presented on that at the CAA. So that is in some sense in the literature.
And then the only other intact site would be the Marysville Paleoindian site, which was also found because of road construction. during some work, Route 8, just outside of Marysville, a few years back now. Again, same thing. There had been some ground prep work done. An archaeologist who works in the city was driving by and took a look at some back dirt piles and noticed some artifacts in them. Some subsequent work basically determined that recovered some scrapers and a denticulate, spurred scraper, probably a few other diagnostic artifacts. I've looked at 4 pieces from that assemblage that appear to be Carboniferous chert. So another example of what a material that looks like Washtenamoke Lake chert, but in a Paleo-Indian context. There's some thinking that the site, it's really sandy there, and so there's thinking this might have been an old beach, probably a well-drained beach area, sort of on the margins of Glacial Lake Acadia. That's based on like local topography and some of the geological work. But we don't have a whole lot of other. I don't know if there's any other excavation that's gone on in a Paleo-Indian site in New Brunswick. Is there?
I'm not sure. No, and am I correct that Marysville is not in the literature yet? It's excavated
there's
by
a short technical report that the province put out, but no publications as yet. No.
Okay, right. Yeah, no peer review publications. I'm unaware of any others in the province. So, but one of the things this may speak to actually, though, is that in places like Maine and the rest of New England, one of the real successes, I think, of government, academic, CRM, and even public collaboration around archaeological research has really been to find out much more about the Paleo-Indian period.
Yeah, and you know, like the finds at Penfield, for example, shifted the places that we were looking for archaeological sites in CRM in New Brunswick. It prompted a shift in the places that we were required to do mandatory testing in, or at least recommend testing in. So, you know, I think having a better sense of where these sites might be located, and doing a better job of identifying those sorts of landscapes will certainly give us a better sense of like a better chance to find another one of these sites intact.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And we've mentioned the importance of cultural resource management for this. And so, some of this is that a characteristic of Paleoindian sites is that they tend to be fairly what archaeologists call low density, which just means not necessarily a ton of stuff. And so the way you find them is by digging holes at pretty close intervals, typically at say 5 or even less, actually, sometimes at 2.5 meter intervals in high probability areas for Paleoindians. And so that is not, if you're a cultural resource management archaeologist, what you want to explain to your client, that you're gonna dig at minute intervals across this landform. And so, but much of the work in Paleoindians in New England has been through those collaborations I just mentioned, and some of that is actually then used avocational archaeologists as well, who are basically have an awareness of these things, and who then have an opportunity to be engaged in mitigating or even identifying Paleoindian sites. And I just wanted to flag 2 programs that I think are the kinds of things we should be thinking about here in Canada. One of these is the Maryland Fluted Point Survey. The other is the New York Paleoindian Database project. These are projects that avocationals report back, especially from farmers' fields, about Paleoindian artifacts they maybe have found. Yeah. And it's this great project, in each case run by government archaeologists, John Lothrop in New York, Zach Singer in Maryland, who's the state archaeologist in Maryland. John Lothrop's the New York State Museum archaeologist. And they go out when one of these artifacts is reported, and they go out with a high resolution GPS and work with the avocational archaeologist to record the location. The avocational archaeologist has access to those data, and they're just, to my mind, they're really fantastic ways to include the avocational community as peers in this research. And as a result, these 2 states have got really good management of that time period and are getting really great resolution on that time period.
Yeah, and if you scale it a little bit further, there's PIDBA, which is the Paleo-Indian Database of the Americas, which, so like, it's funny because, you know, we talked about Paleo-Indian research kind of being this obsession, right? It's also one of the very few kind of big data enterprises in North American archaeology. And so PIDBA, which I'm at a loss to remember who's the spearhead behind this.
I can't. Is it Meltzer? It sounds like a Meltzer.
Oh,
project
it's David Anderson, University of Tennessee. Yeah, yep. So he's a fairly famous Southeast archaeologist, a true geoarchaeologist in every sense of the word. But basically, PIDBA aggregates Paleo-Indian data from across the continent. In particular, has like tracked, like you can pull up this great map that they have of fluted points across North America 13,000 years ago or whatever, right? And a testament to the work that's going on in Eastern North America and in places like Maryland and New York is the incredibly dense clustering of fluted points in Eastern North America, which has prompted people as early as the 50s to speculate that, you know, Clovis maybe has this Eastern origin as opposed to origins in the West. But you know, I think when you look at this, it's maybe a function more of like there's a lot more people and a lot more sort of densely occupied landscapes in the eastern part of the continent. But it is fascinating to see how, you know, how it maps out on a continental scale. We're kind of scaling up, thinking about, you know, the scale of Clovis, for example, at when you're looking at, you can see little dots of Debert up in the northeast tip of this, and then you see these clusters all around the rest of the continent. So pretty neat.
So, are we looking at a half-finished bottle of Courvoisier, Ken? And are we on to hit pieces?
I think we are, yeah.
Well, and we should also say, so we invite the listener to email in if they have helpful suggestions on quality control on this podcast. We are happy to respond to the listener.
Yeah, and happy to have listener mail. You might even win the evening on the Merrimack just by becoming our first listener mail.
It's true. You could be having an iced Dunkin' Donuts in 15 degrees centigrade weather while we overlook a bridge abutment. But the hit piece I've got this week is the Maine Archaeology newsletter, and that is the newsletter of the Maine Archaeological Society. And the Maine Arch Society is probably one of the best bargains in memberships that you could possibly have if you're interested in New Brunswick archaeology. That may sound counterintuitive, but it's nearby. They do presentations twice a year, and sometimes actually in collaboration with the Association of Professional Archaeologists of New Brunswick. Membership is extremely inexpensive. I can't remember how inexpensive it is off the top of my head. It's something like $10 for a student. American dollars.
It's not much more for professionals either.
No, it really isn't. And a very professionally done journal. Really can't recommend it enough. They also have a publication series.
I'm showing actually the cover of this, and then I realized after I was doing that we don't actually show our listeners the video of these podcasts. So
no, not yet. We might
not
someday.
Yet. Yeah, we record these for posterity.
We do. But I wanted to draw in addition to the bulletin, which is the journal that they do a newsletter. And there's an interesting section of the newsletter called The Odd Artifact with Dr. Arthur Spees. Art's the state archaeologist in Maine. Just one of these kind of model old guard New England state archaeologists, super high productivity, super engaged with the discipline. And as we mentioned, I think earlier, a very important Paleoindian researcher.
Yep.
But this is an interesting article about, or it's interesting blurb really, about incised pebbles from a site at the Waterville-Winslow Bridge. And in reboxing these artifacts from a previous project, Art came across this and thought it was worthy of a blurb. There's some analogs to these actually in New Brunswick at the Holt's Point site in coastal New Brunswick. And
you and Arthur Anderson were looking into these not too long ago, right?
We were looking at the region, and so we photographed them. But yeah, they're super cool. They're these incised pebbles. And then the other article in here to check out is Sarah Loftus at the Northeast Archaeological Research Center in Farmington. Has written a short piece on construction monitoring in downtown Portland, Maine.
Very cool.
And it's even got the obligatory every archaeological monitoring project involves finding one creepy looking doll and or figurine. And this has a one
not far off the mark.
Yeah, no, this one's called Frozen Charlotte. And so I encourage the listener to check out the most recent newsletter of the Maine Arc Society.
That's excellent. And I think the only hit piece I have to highlight is that for those of you in New Brunswick who are interested in archaeology and are interested in taking in a full weekend of archaeology and experience, Membertou First Nation is going to be co-hosting the Canadian Archaeological Association annual meeting this year. This will be hosted in Membertou, Nova Scotia. So Membertou First Nation is sort of embedded within the municipal limits of Sydney, Nova Scotia. That conference runs from May 3rd to 7th. You can find out more information about the conference itself on canadianarchaeology.com/CAA/annual-meeting. And there's information in there about if you have a paper you might want to submit, a session you might want to host, or if you are just a member of the public looking to attend for a day or two. It looks like they have daily rates starting at as little as $50 for students, or non-archaeologists as low as 15 or less dollars. So come join us in Membertou. Gabe and I will be there. We might even be hosting our first live podcast. Would that be?
I think we were going to try to do some kind of live sode from Membertou.
I'm not sure if I'm comfortable with that terminology.
It makes me a little uncomfortable as well. But actually, since you mentioned the live podcast, we should say we're also we're going to start trying to plug in some special eps, perhaps to fill in the in-betweens. We've got some ideas for that.
Yeah, and what you might find in this episode is by the time we do all the editing, you might get a first glimpse at this week, and you might get the part 2 next week, because we're clocking it at close to 2 hours tonight, and I'm not sure if the listeners are ready for that yet. So
well, I feel like this my partner in when she was in medical school would listen to sometimes they had recordings of the lectures, and there were apparently some lecturers that just sounded a little better at 1.5 speed. That might be us. So.
That's how I listen when I'm editing, actually.
Fantastic.
Try to fast forward to the parts where I know we need to clip.
Yeah. Well, speaking of clipping, Ken, I think we're at a half finished bottle of Courvoisier, and I think we should say goodbye to the listener until our next fortnight has passed.
Yeah, and so thank you all for listening again. Obviously, subscribe or follow us on whichever your favorite podcasting platform is, and we look forward to hearing from you, our first listener mail.
We'll talk to you soon, listener. Outro.